Good morning, everyone. It's my very great pleasure to be chairing this first substantive panel of the conference. And before turning to our distinguished guests here, I just wish to reaffirm the welcome from both the college and the centre, which I direct, the Russia and Eurasia Studies Centre. St Agnes College is the most international of the colleges in Oxford. We've had a tradition really of outreach in our research and seminars, in our activities to practitioner communities as well as to the academic world. We also have it's unusual in Oxford in having regional studies centres which allow us really to deeply research to provide a contextual understanding to developments, in particular historical, societal, cultural processes. And so I think it is fitting to have the conference here, where we can have the involvement of others who have that kind of specialist knowledge, more from the research and academic perspective. We also have a particular interest in the South Caucasus, which has been developing rapidly in recent years. There is a Georgian studies program, in fact, attached to the teaching department, Russian and East European Studies. We have students also from all three South Caucasus countries regularly. They do their own research. And I may mention that just recently the Oriental Institute here in the university has new funding, which will allow a particular focus on the culture, language, and history of the region. So I think it's particularly appropriate to have this here, the third such a seminar, which we have been able to organise through, well, in fact, it has really been Dennis Samwerton and Links, and we're honoured to be able to host this third iteration of the Caucasus seminar. I think it is appropriate also for us now to turn to the domestic dimension, domestic context to the discussions which will follow. There has been quite some development in the last year or two, but of course the relevance here is the interaction with the regional, and one may also say to some extent with these contested global developments. And I think some of the those interactions and how they affect processes on the ground will come through, I'm sure, in our discussion. So we do not have very much time for each panel, so I'll turn to our speakers to offer comments briefly, and then we will have the opportunity for some Q&A and involvement of the audience. So our first speaker is Zaur Shiriev, who's at the International Crisis Group.
Yes.
Please.
Thank you, Professor. So thank you for invitation to this discussion. So actually, I'm going to speak the maximum 7-8 minutes, and so I'm speaking here in my personal capacity. So first of all, I would like to talk a little bit about the domestic political context and then its impact to external factors. First of all, the Azerbaijani domestic and external relations are undoubtedly oil dependent. The oil revenues are an important element of government legitimacy in the eyes of this population, which guarantees the minimal economic gains. Without economic stability, the government's public standing is going to be under risk. So, unlike often assumed, the political legitimacy of government is not dependent on ideology. So it's mostly the economic gains. And this is also crucial in the foreign relations, which the oil economy is making the country is less dependent to foreign countries. So since 2014, there are discussion about this Azerbaijani reform agenda in Azerbaijan, but actually there is no genuine reform agenda implemented in Azerbaijan. There is some progress, but this is not it's hard to call it as a reform. And also making Azerbaijan is a non-oil dependent is a long path to go. There is a joke in Azerbaijan when the government officials says that, okay, this is what they say when they say that about this the non-oil economy. People understood outside as a non-fossil economy, but it's actually non-oil is a gas. So when actually you are decreasing the dependency to the energy, but also you are increasing dependency to the gas revenues. So after the constitutional reform in 2016, I don't want to touch about this domestic political context because this is going to be a different discussion. So since 2016, the government doesn't see any internal domestic, how to say, the challenge to their governance, but there are many challenges coming from external relations. I would like to mention the main important things. First of all, is that the developments in Iran and in and around Iran, and also precisely the U.S. sanction on Iran. As we know, there is an exception on Shah Deniz, the natural gas field in Azerbaijan sector of Caspian Sea, which is the new U.S. sanction is going to target Azerbaijan, but also there are some areas that is going to target Azerbaijan on sanction policy. The first is that Azerbaijan and Iran signed back to March 2018 agreement on joint development of the Caspian and hydrocarbon resources, which is also included this disputed the oil and gas fields in the sourcing part of Azerbaijan, which has a huge reserves. For the shorter and the medium term, this the Alov Shark and Araz, the disputed oil and gas field will be a very real, has a real capacity to boost Azerbaijan internal consumption and also external sale. So under this condition, probably there will not be any outside cooperation on the disputed oil fields because of this this sanction. The second is that important thing is that Azerbaijan-Iran the gas swap deal. So Azerbaijan imports a small volume of Iranian gas into its exclave of Nakhchivan for local consumption, and in exchange exports to northern Iran. So this puts, the new sanctions puts the situation in Nakhchivan at risk, and the government will need to seek an alternatives. The third issue is the ongoing transportation project which in Iranian territory Azerbaijan is financing, which is the northern South corridor, and so there is a danger that there will not be any international funding and also the support for this project in the coming years. The second external challenge I see with Russia and Turkey, I don't want to look in deeper about the Russian relations, because the Russian relation is like that is sometimes overestimated, sometimes is underestimated relations. So right now there's the Western sanctions to Russia and also some extent the deterioration relations of the United States and the Turkey also risky policy, because because of the economic cooperation between the Russia and Azerbaijan, also remittances coming from Russia to Azerbaijan is also going to affect the local populations, the standard life. And the third issue is the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict resolution. I think that my colleague probably is going to tell more about the domestic political context in Armenia, but I would like to tell the challenges coming from Nagorno-Karabakh conflict resolution. Fortunately, what happened in Armenia in April is actually they bring new ideas and new the team and new generation to the government, which is actually offering an opportunity. But unfortunately, what happened until the last 6 months is not offering that optimistic the future for Nagorno-Karabakh conflict resolution. For various reasons. The first reason is that the statements of the Armenian leadership about this Nagorno-Karabakh conflict resolution is not actually offering any strategy for future. So this part is not clear to the whole population. The part of this also the Armenian government claims or the statements, sometimes statements about unification of the Nagorno-Karabakh with Armenia, and also how to say about the status of the 7 adjacent regions is also how to say makes the situation is even worse, because it can make the new Armenian leadership hostage of their statements in the future if they are going to elaborate and more openness in Nagorno-Karabakh conflict resolution. I would say that right now the risk of this new escalation is limited, but I wouldn't say that after 6 or 7 months this is going to be not risky. Because I mean there is a maximalist opinions coming from both sides. I will say that right now in Azerbaijan, maximalist opinion is that in the next 1 year they would like to see a very tangible results, which I think it's not realistic. So under this reality, it's hard to predict that what might happen in the coming years, but hypothetical scenarios for this region have really emerged. Looking back to what experts, including me, predicted for this year, none of our predictions have been realized. So I mean that making a prediction is easy things, but it's very hard to see. In conclusion, I would like to mention the line from the Greek poet, and which brought to the wider discourse by the great Oxford historian Isaiah Berlin, that fox knows many things, but the hedgehog knows one big thing. I mean, if we can use this, how to say, it has many interpretations, but we can use about this, if we would like to categorize the South Caucasus countries, which actually is acting like hedgehog. The one big thing is also defending themselves and also not cooperating hugely. So I mean, the big thinking should change in the coming years, which can bring a real development for the countries. And also, this should apply to the expert community in Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Georgia when it comes to when we are going to discuss these things. And so we shouldn't be the hedgehog, and we shouldn't only defend on one thing, one idea.
Thank you. So let's turn directly to next speaker, Georgi Helashvili.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Links, and also Russia and Eurasia Program for inviting me to speak. It's a privilege. Also, I have to mention that I advise the chairman of Georgian Parliament in Foreign Affairs, but here I'm mostly speaking in personal capacity, though what I'm going to say luckily is not very different from the government position. Last time I spoke at St. Anthony's 10 years ago, it was a panel in the aftermath of Georgia-Russian war. It was, I think, October 2008. I remember Professor Herzig was also on the panel. And I have to say that the international environment did not change much since then. It's remarkably stable in the Caucasus, around the Caucasus. And also, by large, domestic dynamics in the three countries did not change, even though we had major government change in Georgia 6 years ago, and we also had major government change in Armenia 6 months ago. Today, I'll be speaking about Georgian domestic politics and bring up the most vexing issue in the politics right now, which is unexpected results of the first round of presidential election in Georgia, which happened on the 28th of October. Contrary to the government's expectations, the government and opposition roughly scored the same number of percents, and that was around 40 each. And these results, and we are facing a rerun in about 3 weeks' time. These results were interpreted as sensational, even if previously the ruling Georgian Dream won 5 elections hands down: presidential, general elections, local elections, in a free and fair competition. Also, the presidency, which is contested now because of constitutional changes, is largely a symbolic position from now onwards. So whatever these elections, as well as previous 5 elections, would be a good result, good political result for any political party. But right now, Georgian politics is very polarized, very unpredictable, and generates a lot of hype. So what I'll pose as a question is, why is Georgian politics so emotionally charged and polarized, despite the relative political and economic progress that Georgia made not only in the last few years, but also in the last 15 years in general, which was widely recognized? So Georgia is not a happy place right now, despite the fact that we have relatively stable institutional structure of the government, which is developing, making progress. The recently reformed constitution laid foundation for a hopefully lasting parliamentary democracy in a form of parliamentary republic. And also a more or less stable political party structure is also emerging in the country. We are enjoying an annual growth between 4 and 5%, which is pretty high for the region. And also the rule of law and media freedom have been improving year by year. So nonetheless, as I said, Georgia is not a terribly happy place right now. It's very polarized and very embittered. I will try to give my version of why it is happening and what the outlook is. The obvious reason for embitterment is that almost a third of the population is impoverished, lives below the line of poverty. And it is their votes that sway election in either way. That is probably what happened in 2012 against Saakashvili, and this is what might be happening now. So these protest votes, so to speak, they don't vote along ideological lines or political party lines. These are the protest votes. But why so? There are probably about 1,200,000 people like that, 200,000 people like that. And the government aim is to diminish the ratio of the poor population to 800,000 in a few years' time. I think the major issue is that the inequality did not diminish in the last 15 years, despite the growth of the economy, which is a particularly acute problem given that Georgian is an egalitarian society since the Soviet times. One more important aspect of the political polarization of Georgia is fracturing of the media scene. Georgian mass media is largely free. At the same time, I think what we are witnessing is very steady and unfortunate shrinking of what one would like to call true journalism. And the media, especially TV channels, are now taking increasingly political lines. It's something that is not unseen around the world, but it seems Georgian political landscape is following the suit. The same can be said about civil society organizations, because many of them are consumed by politics and frequently take sides. Also, Georgian Orthodox Church, despite being very influential, in a way did not step in to mediate political conflict or take sides. Another factor influencing polarization of Georgia is, I would say, weakening conditionality from the West. And that contributes to the crumbling consensus among the political elites. Even if Western integration is still a strong preference. And finally, we still live in the conditions of very strong and uncompromising nationalist discourse, which is still the foundation of the political discourse in Georgia. And essentially this discourse makes any discussion of Georgia's foreign policy or conflict resolution or domestic politics a very difficult matter, especially with relation to Russia when it comes to radical versus pragmatic policy orientation. And finally, where this may lead us. Georgia, in a sense, is not an outlier or an exception, and falls under the regional and European tendencies with its radicalization and these political characteristics, for better or worse. Interestingly, second observation is that political polarization, so far did not lead to radicalization in Georgia, unlike some European countries, Eastern European or Western European countries. Even though mostly governments fail to meet the high expectations of the population in terms of conflict resolution, restoration of territorial integrity, strong economic progress, and so on. Despite these, the consensus about that Georgia should be an independent country is still there and seems to be actually getting stronger. And final observation is that in political terms, by large, despite the progress that we have been making, Georgia remains, one would say, an in-between state when we have not yet become a full European democracy, but one would not say either that that there is a failure of the European project or a statehood project. Thank you.
Thank you. And finally, to Lucine Harachan.
Thank you for the opportunity. Before speaking about the internal situation in Armenia, I would like to say that I'm neither a political analyst or a political scientist, and there was a colleague of mine who is a University of Oxford graduate who was supposed to be here and speak about this, but unfortunately due to rapidly changing situation in Armenia, he could not make it. And I would have to take his role, and I would be happy to answer any questions. So whatever I will be speaking about, it's from my personal observations and what I have been seeing in Armenia, but I would be, of course, glad to answer your questions. I will focus on the current situation, more or less, and this is a situation created after the Velvet Revolution that happened in Armenia in this spring. And as you know, it was against Ser Sarkisyan, who was going to become Armenia's prime minister after the constitution was tailored for him to become the prime minister. And there was a movement against Ser Sarkisyan becoming a prime minister in Armenia, and that movement was led by political party Civil Contract and plus some other groups, including Reject Serge and other civic activist groups who joined the movement and eventually made this revolution possible. After that, as you probably know, the government was controlled by Civil Contract mostly, but the parliament still remained a place where a Republican country had the majority, even though some changes and repositions happened within the parliament as well. So now what is on the agenda in Armenia internally, the most important thing is snap elections that are scheduled for December 9. And this is by November 14, all political parties would have to kind of get their lists registered and get ready for campaign and go for the elections. What we are having in the political, what kind of elections we are going to have, it's interesting to note that in these last 10 or more years, this is the first time in Armenia when people say we know more or less who is going to get the majority vote, but we don't know who is going to be second and third, and this is already good because the elections are perceived generally to be free and open, and the voter turnout and their voting will define who will end up being in parliament. As many of you probably know, in September there were Yerevan municipality elections where again the Civil Contract bloc, which renamed itself into a bloc of My Step, because the movement itself was My Step, won the elections and got around 80% of control over Yerevan municipality, and the predictions say that this is more or less what is going to happen with parliamentary elections as well, and this bloc, or the bloc led by Prime Minister Pashinyan, is likely to get control over the parliament. The rest, as I said, is unclear who will be the second and third parties represented in the parliament, but what we already know, we know that yesterday Republican Party made a statement and said that they are also going to take part in the elections, with the former Minister of Defense, Vigen Sarkisyan, leading the list of the party, but also some other people from the outside joining the party, like David Shahnazarian, who has been before with HHS, which was the Levon Ter-Petrosyan party, but for years he kind of was more or less independent, but is now joining Republican Party in the coming elections. We know that the other acting political parties will also take part in the elections, but we don't know the outcome. So the predictions are now that the parties, Civil Contract, My Step bloc led by Pashinyan, Republican Party, Prosperous Armenia, are likely to take part in elections, and also Enlightened Armenia and Republic Party, which were before in the same bloc with Pashinyan, are going to take part in elections, but as separate participants, not as a bloc anymore. And also, which is interesting, this is Sasnat Zarer, and as you probably know, this is the most radical group in the Armenian politics at the moment. This is the group that took over the police station 2 years ago, and who are very radical in terms of both internal and external political views. What is interesting, I think, with these elections is that the future will be defined based on what Civil Contract will end up having in their electoral lists. Why? Because depending on the people they will choose to include, it would more or less define how Armenia will go in the future, because it's obvious already that they will have, they are likely to have more than 70 or 70% in the parliament. And until now, we don't know who is exactly included in their lists. There are several possibilities, and as said, depending on whether they will end up choosing people who are loyal to the leadership or choosing people who are likely to bring more pluralism into the parliament, it would also be clear what is going to happen in Armenia in the coming years. And why? It is mainly because until now Civil Contract does not have a clear political platform or political program. At least, it's unclear whether they are more towards right or towards left or centrists, and maybe with these elections they will have an opportunity to have a program or platform which is likely to define what their views are on both domestic and also external matters. And therefore it's a very crucial elections for Armenia, depending on their program and depending on what they end up bringing as their representatives into the parliament. So many things will become more or less clear in the coming 2 weeks before the elections in terms of their program and in terms of people who are also going to be in the parliament and in the government. With the other parties, because at the moment, at least the predictions say that they will be the minority anyway. It would really largely depend on how people will vote. Two also important things before the elections, as some of you also probably know, there was an attempt to change the electoral code. And in case if the electoral code would be changed, there would be more possibility for having more diverse, probably also representation in the parliament. But as the electoral code was not changed, and now there are these so-called rating lists, especially elections in the regions, but also in Yerevan, could still bring more results to Republican Party and Prosperous Armenia Party, because it includes people who are going to be voted in their districts, and these are, from the past we know, these are people who are influential in district level, and it's not necessarily political people. These could be people who have different types of power and can influence the outcome of elections. And even though the elections, as I said, are predicted to be free and open, we don't know how this is going to influence the outcome of elections overall. One important thing also, which is related to electoral code that was not changed, that there was an attempt to kind of increase women involvement in the parliament, but as it was not accepted, now we will go with the former electoral code, which implies that at least there would be 25% around women, most probably in the lists, and even lower in the parliament. So this is about elections. I would be open to answer questions, and I hope my colleagues from Armenia will help me with answering these questions, because as said, I'm not a political analyst, and I'm kind of talking only from whatever I have been able to observe. Another interesting thing before elections, I think, which also could impact the outcome, is that, as you probably know, the Velvet Revolution had a slogan of love and solidarity, and many say that revolution was possible because poor people and people who have been suffering from social injustice in Armenia for years have joined the revolution. Initially, they were not the backbone of the movement, but from the moment when these people joined the revolution, it became possible. And until now, Nikol Pashinyan has been really speaking their voices as well, but most recently, 2 days ago, he made a speech where he talked about 800,000 people in Armenia not working, and I mean not wanting to work, but in opposition of 850,000 who are paying taxes, and like these people are living on taxes of 350,000 citizens, and they are not willing to work. And this brought a new discussion saying that, okay, the revolution was possible because of these people who are poor, and we have been having stable, very high poverty rates and unemployment rates. Like 30% of Armenia's population is below poverty line officially. And now this kind of statement kind of brings a new thing into the revolution and is likely to jeopardize the society. However, this is still being discussed, and many are saying that this was not the main point he wanted to make, but he was speaking from the state perspective, creating more opportunities for people to work, and it was not for poor people, just ignoring poor people and ignoring social issues that exist in Armenia. However, this was one statement that kind of changed the rhetoric that was before and brought at least a position about issues that he has been very cautious and careful to not touch in this manner. So right before elections, this might bring a new discussion into the political arena. Another interesting thing that I would like to mention is after the revolution, what we are seeing, many people are trying to self-censor themselves and not criticize the government even when they find it necessary to criticize, because they don't want to harm the revolution and they don't want to be manipulated, because whatever they say can be manipulated and used against the revolution that they have been also for. Hopefully, when the elections happen, this would also, people would stop self-censoring themselves, because the entire political but also social repositioning will become clearer. Many political, not only parties, but civil society and outspoken individuals will reposition themselves and will feel free to criticize when they find it necessary. And what we see now is a really growing number of fake news in Armenia, which was not that much of a case before. It was considered to be more a European issue rather than an issue in Armenia. However, with the revolution and after the revolution, we see that this fake news is becoming more and more an issue for Armenian society as well. And many things that people are saying on one or another side of political divide gets, especially whatever the current government is saying, gets really easily manipulated and circulated through fake news. And as many people do not have basic media literacy, this becomes an issue, and this has been obvious in some cases recently. Especially some media that was used by former, by Serge Sarkisian's son-in-law, who is known to control many media outlets. He also now is working very actively on this fake news, and it's an issue. That's it. I will not speak anymore, and thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Clearly, that was an interesting contribution, understanding the political fluidity with it. Now, I'm going to take questions now. I hope that at least we can have some discussion of the link really between the state and the regional level. In other words, the regional visions and agendas of local state level political forces and developments, because that I think in turn will be important for our broader discussion today. So please identify yourself, and do we have any roving mics? Or yes. So we'll just wait for the microphone to come when you wish to put your question or point. Who would like to offer a view first? Yes, please.
My name is Will Pryor. I'm a colleague of Zawar's at the Crisis Group. He mentioned our alumnus, Isaiah Berlin, and his belief about the hedgehog and the fox. He's also famous for saying that logical objections are, in principle, no use in dealing with beliefs about realities, and I wondered if the panel might be able to identify, this is certainly a problem that we are now encountering in the UK, are there beliefs about regional cooperation in your respective countries that are an obstacle to regional cooperation, and how might the domestic political elites address those?
Perhaps we could take 2 or 3 questions and then come back to the panel together, because these are some quite broad concerns. Yes, Al.
Mark Richard. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Mark Richard, London. I was more for the first panel actually, but if the second panel could address it, that would be great. Russia, the elephant in the room, jumps up and down if there's any moves towards political union, particularly with reference to Georgia, and perhaps less so with less steps towards political union from Armenia. And certainly on NATO accession for Georgia, obviously that doesn't apply for Armenia. But I just wondered what the panel's view is on whether on trading issues Russia is less exercised. So both for Armenia, and yes, of course, the association agreement didn't go ahead. There is an alternative form of that with Armenia, whilst also facing the Eurasian Union. And also, Georgia obviously has a steep and a comprehensive free trade agreement, and clearly the commercial links are very strong with the European Union, with Azerbaijan to speak for themselves. So trade and investment, is that sort of okay for Russia, but political union and defence association, clearly not. Question.
Right, perhaps a domestic understanding of that. Is there a third question? Edmund.
Thank you. Edmund Herzig, Oxford. I just wonder if our panelists could tell us something about how, especially in Georgia and Armenia, where we have quite interesting and in some ways new political situation, how the regional dynamics are playing into that. How is that reflected? What are the positions of the different actors in respect of that?
Okay, so perhaps we'll take them from sort of reverse order of speakers to comment on any of those three questions as they see fit.
I think among these three questions also I'm going to answer the first one about this regional cooperation and how the local elites are seeing this regional cooperation. I will say, if you ask any the elite members or the part of the government people, they think that they are actually fully integrated to the regional cooperation. The only limit is that their cooperation with Armenia for obvious reasons. So, and they are built a strategy of isolating Armenia from all regional cooperation in the South Caucasus with the support of this Turkey. And this seems to the majority of Azerbaijan elite as a sanction policy, and this a policy that until the resolution of the conflict, this is going to be the main the policy line for the Azerbaijani government. If you ask this question to opposition members or the counter elite, I mean, I'm pretty sure that you wouldn't hear a alternative opinion. I mean, so this is the how to say unique. The position is coming from the all political forces in Azerbaijan, but you can hear much more the confidence and cooperation opportunities. If you ask other people, probably they would like to see much more economic cooperation in Georgia, Azerbaijan, and Armenia. They didn't want to see the limitation of this the local communities cooperation. In case of the trade between the countries, that it's understandable this is not going to happen. But in the case of the communities, this should be supported. Only diverse opinion would be about its local communities, as far as I know.
Okay, Gyoki?
Thank you. Well, with respect to objective reality versus beliefs, I think that might be true with respect to domestic politics, and I think most of my presentation was about exactly that objectively, you don't have any basis for being so embittered and vitriolic, in Georgian politics, but once you consider the discourse and then the beliefs and expectations or failed expectations, then it's perfectly understandable. So it's not so much the objective basis for political change as much as the excitement that may influence it. As for regional cooperation, I'm a bit of a skeptic on that side. And here I would say that neither objective reality nor beliefs favor the possibilities for regional cooperation. If you take the Georgian case, then Georgia is mostly oriented in its cooperative policies towards the European Union. And in case of Armenia and Azerbaijan, because of Nagorno-Karabakh, there is very little basis for any even sort of prospective cooperation. And even if there had existed any kind of economic basis in terms of intercomplementarity of goods and so on, resources and so on, then beliefs would still be enough to stop that positive dynamic in the South Caucasus. With respect to Russian reaction to Georgia and NATO, which is yes, and then trade and the association agreement, there is an interesting phenomenon. If you look at the newly signed SEPA between Armenia and the European Union, which is sort of association agreement redux, in a sense, what I heard from the Armenian side, its political element is very robust with the European Union, but the economic part is sort of not quite there. And in Georgia's case, it's exactly the opposite. The economic part actually is the strongest probably, with the DCFTA, the free trade area. So this balance, when I asked my Armenian colleagues where it stems from, they explained it with the Eurasian Union and Armenia's movement towards the Eurasian Union economically. As for Georgia's case, I think there is also difference between between Ukraine and Georgia. When Ukraine tried to integrate economically with the European Union, Russians did what they did 4 years ago. So it's a puzzle. Why would then Russians let Georgians go towards the European Union and sign the association agreement with its economic and trade component? And I think the solution to this puzzle is somewhat that I think Russians, by and large, decided that Georgia is economically, they can let Georgia go. And it is the security element that they are very concerned about. I think they distinguish between the two quite clearly. In case of Armenia, in case of Ukraine, in case of Georgia. And this choice between economics and politics, so to speak, is not always uniform in these cases. What determines it from the Russian perspective is, I think, in each case very unique and very specific. Regional dynamics and domestic developments. I think I would just repeat what Natalie said, that changing balance of power in the region has surprisingly little bearing on Georgian foreign policy. Why that's happening? Actually, I was thinking about writing a book about explaining that. It's an outlier case. Despite 2008, despite a lot of pressure, Georgians sort of didn't move. And that can be just a basis for an entire research project to me. Thank you.
Thank you. There is, of course, also the option referred to by Ambassador Sabanadze of something more sub-regional, Georgia, Azerbaijan, Turkey, and how developments there have been proceeding. But we'll have the opportunity to discuss the larger players in the next session. So let's just hear.
So in terms of Armenia's foreign policy, as you know, it is announced that it is not changing, it's the same. So more or less this would stay the same. The changes are likely to happen within Armenia and not with respect to its international obligations and foreign policy. But as to regional cooperation, I would like to say that there is more and more speaking about necessity of better regional cooperation, and maybe, as you know, first visit of Pashinyan foreign visit was to Georgia, because Armenia kind of wants to be more cooperating with its neighbors, and there is a conversation about strengthening this area of regional cooperation with the neighbors, even though, as you know, we are in a very difficult situation with our neighbors. So SEPA has been signed, and I think this week we were to send an implementation plan for SEPA agreement to EU, which has been worked out by an intergovernmental group established for that purpose only. And Armenia is going to work on the implementation of SEPA agreement as well. Russia is still an important player, and as said, no foreign policies Russia-Armenia relations are not likely to change in the coming future. This is what I can say from whatever is known at the moment.
Thank you. We have time for a few more questions, if there are those, before we break for coffee this first session. Yes?
Stefan Schrader, Researcher Associated at the Center for International Studies. One of the things we're observing in East Central Europe, the region I focus on, is the decline of the idea of the West. Becoming Western, being Western, joining the West has lost its currency. With it came a declining support for liberal democratic model. How attractive is the idea of the Western region? How much of a hit has liberal democracy as an idea, as a set of ideas, taken in the region? And maybe related to this, in a world of strong leaders, in a world where cooperative institutions are under attack, is becoming a democracy perceived as a liability, and is that a factor that plays a role?
Thank you. Right. Let's just hold that very interesting question. And yes.
Thank you very much. I am Elusive at St. Anthony's College. I have a very short, simple question. How far do minorities, or how far do the issues on minorities play an important role in foreign political discourse as well in domestic politics?
What minorities?
Okay. Let's take those two questions. And who would like to?
So, in terms of the idea of West, recently we hear more and more that we are neither pro-Western or pro-Russia, we are pro-Armenia, but the revolution is a revolution of values, and in terms of values we are democratic. This is a revolution of values that are democratic, that are more of, if you wish, traditionally known as Western values. So in terms of values, that is something which the revolution says that's a revolution of values, but not positioning geographically towards West or East, but positioning rather towards Armenia. This is a discourse we are having in Armenia, which is quite interesting, and I don't know where it will lead and what kind of conversations it will bring. The second question on minorities, did you mean national, all types of minorities, or ethnical and religious? So Armenia is a very mono-ethnic country, as you probably know, with 98% of population being ethnically Armenian. And how it plays in terms of its foreign policy, I don't think it really has a big impact on that. But what is being very much manipulated currently is more the sexual minorities and their rights in Armenia, and especially by fake news and other kinds of groups. This is being explicitly positioned as something Western and not belonging to our Armenian culture and brought by other powers. So this is something which is being discussed, especially these past months. There were a lot of discussions around this issue, but national, religious, ethnic minorities are not in this discussion. It is mostly with LGBT rights, and there is an anti-discrimination law that needs to be discussed after the elections, and maybe with this it would be more or less clear.
Sure. Decline of the idea of the West. As I mentioned, there is surprisingly little radicalization in Georgia, despite the polarization of politics, compared with Eastern Europe or Western Europe. There are fringe groups that vocally challenge the idea of liberal democracy and the movement to the West. I think there can be some vague feeling in the population about, especially with this polarization and emotionally charged political environment, many may feel that democracy is not necessarily a terribly good thing. But the interesting fact about Georgian politics is that now we have what some political scientists describe as democracy without Democrats, if you will. I'm sure, even though I work for the government, I'm sure that any political group in Georgia would love to grab power and then, just deal with the opposition as much as they can, but as much as they want. But effectively, nobody can do that anymore. And this, the recent results was exactly an indication that we are in this sort of deadlock that is not terribly good for governance. But I think it is good for democracy, even if it's very unpleasant to observe Georgian politics at the moment. As for the minorities and their influence on foreign policy and domestic politics, integration of minorities is getting better, I would say. And the recent elections was another litmus test for that. Traditionally, Armenian and Azerbaijani populated regions of Georgia were used by the governments in previous decades for easy votes. they usually would overwhelmingly vote for the incumbent. Not anymore. And I think this was side effect of pretty effective government integration policies towards Armenian and Azerbaijani minorities. In foreign political terms, how they are important is that these minorities serve as a political anchor, anchors for good relations with both Armenia and Azerbaijan. Georgian government is sort of constantly balancing its foreign policy between the two, and this is for the international political balancing, but also it's because of these two large minorities that have increasingly their say in Georgian politics.
Thank you.
About the first question is this idea of the West. I mean, in Azerbaijan, if you compare 90s and today, and there is a different feelings and understanding of the idea of the West in the country. And so because this idea of the West back to 90s was that the Western integration in terms of that foreign policy direction. And mostly foreign policy direction was the oil and gas the projects, and it actually made an attachment to the pro-European foreign policy line. But when it came to the values with respect to the rule of law, changing transformation of the system, it has never been considered as a pro-Western line and the Westernization in the country. But the problem is that also there are misunderstanding of the West in the country, not only in government, also in civil society, also in the opposition politicians. So still the people are seeing the pro-Western line only integration. I mean, integration to the European Union, membership to the NATO, membership to the EU. When it comes to the values, I mean, even the most people who actually see themselves as a pro-Western, they never talk about the values, the reforms, and the transformation. So this is the main issue that I see, that misunderstanding the Western values. So the second issue about this minorities, let's say we have many minorities in Azerbaijan is living. I will say that there are respect to the minorities, and also this was a commitment to the government since Azerbaijan joined to the Council of Europe. But I don't see a role of the minorities in the foreign policy direction. But sometimes minorities became a tool or the pretext by some countries using for internal instability. Especially it was in the beginning in 1993, 1994, 1995, when there was minorities in the south and the north of Azerbaijan actually became the secessionist movement they created. So with the support of the third foreign countries. But right now I think they became a much more apolitical. But if you ask this question to the government, if they start a very sincere discussion with you, I mean, for them minorities is actually Azerbaijan is living in Iran, Azerbaijan is living in Georgia, and Azerbaijan living outside of the country, which is they have a crucial impact in the thinking of the Azerbaijani foreign policy with neighboring countries.
Thank you. So let's conclude this first panel. I think we've had some very interesting points discussed here, good foundation for the day's proceedings. We've got coffee outside. Let's try and reconvene around midday to keep us on time. Thank you very much for all three panelists.
It was a pleasure.